Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to all of you here at Rosecliff and to our friends who are with us on Zoom. We're happy to have you here this evening at the Eaddo and Peter Kiernan lecture, the second and final lecture presentation by our research fellows this year. It's always a happy time in August to see sort of the summer season coming to a close, but it's also one of the hardest times for us because we know it is then the end of our fellowship terms. And as I probably said last week, but at the risk of repeating myself, it's so important to note this program is so incredibly valuable to the Preservation Society. To have the next generation of museum leaders and scholars coming and working on our collections, learning so much about them that we don't have the capacity or time to do so, and then taking that research and information and bringing it out into more of the field and carrying Newport and its story with them is a legacy that will be built upon for years and years to come and will only benefit us in the long run. And I just want to thank them, each of them, for all of the wonderful contributions they've made far outside just research, but being a part of our community, volunteering with our staff, and really getting an experience of what it means to work on a larger team of a very complex organization. So I just want to make sure I take time to thank them, and of course to thank Dr. Catherine Moran, who is the manager of the Research Fellow Program. She deserves a round of applause. And of course, as I say that things are wrapping up here in August, we of course have lots on the calendar here, so we hope that many of you will be joining us this Thursday for the Christine Baranski lecture at the Elms. Coaching is of course upon us. There's lots of wonderful activities happening. We have a lecture which is sold out unfortunately, but we hope that you are registered for that. And then of course the coaching exposition that takes place on the Elms. So please keep an eye on Preservation Society activities throughout the month of August and going forward. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Priscilla Bright, and also followed by her will be Isabella Hogan. They'll be one after each other, so if you could please hold your questions until the end. Kate Pedersen and I will run around with a microphone, and we'll look forward to hearing more of your questions for them, because I hope this makes you very interested in our collections and our furniture. So first with Priscilla. Priscilla Bright is a curatorial fellow and has spent her time in Newport researching items selected for inclusion in our first ever collections catalog, which is forthcoming. This seems like a natural continuation of her graduate work at Durham University, where she received a Master of Arts in Museum and Artifact Studies and selected research projects with Newport themes, including Alice Vanderbilt's Electric Light Gown, which is at the Museum of the City of New York's collection. In addition to a successful summer working as a museum educator and associate tour guide here at the Preservation Society, Priscilla has experience working as a gallery assistant for Galerie Beauté du Matin Comme in Paris, the Guild of Boston Artists in Boston, and Anchor Bend Glassworks in Newport, Rhode Island. Priscilla's unique blend of education and experience has enriched our institutional knowledge and uncovered previously untold stories about our collection's objects and the fascinating individuals who made and collected them. Isabella Hogan is a conservation fellow and earned a BA in archaeology, first class at the University of Cambridge, King's College, and was awarded the Glyn Daniel Prize and Scholar of the College status due to her distinguished academic performance. She further excelled at the University of Durham, they're both Durham graduates, so plug for Durham, where she earned an MA in Conservation of Archaeological and Museum Objects with distinction. Isabella has worked as a project conservator for the Maritime Museum in Liverpool, England, and as a conservation intern for the Mary Rose Trust in Portsmouth, England, and the Bevering Center Fyn in Langeland, Denmark, hope I did that justice, and Agora Excavations Conservation Laboratory of the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, Greece. The focus of her fellowship at the Preservation Society has been the suite of furniture commissioned by Ogden Codman Jr. and manufactured by A.H. Davenport of Boston for the third floor of the Breakers, which is, of course, the residence of Alice and Cornelius Vanderbilt. Tonight she will share the results of her furniture survey and archival research, which has greatly aided in our understanding of not only our collection of Davenport furniture, but also of methods of furniture manufacture in the late 19th century and daily experience of living at the breakers. It's a lot to uncover in just a few short minutes that they have. So I'm not going to take up any more time, and we look forward to, of course, hearing your questions afterwards, but let's welcome Priscilla to the stage. We can't wait to hear from you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Priscilla Bright, and I'm excited to share highlights of my work from this year as a curatorial research fellow, working towards the forthcoming Preservation Society of Newport County Collections Catalog. This catalog presents a unique opportunity to explore selected treasures from the tens of thousands of objects stewarded by the Preservation Society. Dating from ancient times to the modern era, the collection of the Preservation Society is vast and diverse, including paintings, sculptures, ceramics, furniture, fashion, and more. This evening, I am delighted to share a few of my personal favorites and provide an insider's perspective on the research process that helps illuminate and contextualize these remarkable objects. Those of you who have visited one or more of the Preservation Society's properties have had the opportunity to encounter these objects as a part of the tour experience. While it's wonderful to see these collections within their Gilded Age context, it's not always easy to see them up close and with the attention they really deserve. Our guests tend to be overwhelmed by our architectural grandeur and sometimes overlook or entirely miss the smaller treasures that they house. To provide a new avenue for appreciating our collections, our curatorial team has selected 100 objects for inclusion in the first ever collections catalog. Objects were selected to showcase the breadth and richness of our holdings and tell important, diverse stories. The images on this slide represent catalog objects I've researched during my fellowship this year. For many of them, the Gilded Age was just a chapter in their lives rather than their origin story. So let's begin by starting with one of my favorites. To demonstrate why the catalog is so important, I thought I would first start with this photo of the interior of the south parlor of Kingscote. I took this photograph from the perspective of a guest on the tour. The first object that I'm talking about tonight is in this photo. Take a minute, get your guesses together. Can you guess what it is? Can you guess what it is now that I've circled it? This discreetly displayed illuminated manuscript cutting on the north wall of the parlor is just about 6 by 6 inches. The rich ornamentation and intricate details can only be fully appreciated through close examination, something that certainly would have been done by its first owner, David Maitland Armstrong, and his guests. However, from the perspective of the tour path, this wonderful object is easily overlooked and impossible to study in detail. Viewed in the context of the forthcoming collections catalog, the significance and beauty of this object can be revealed. I've chosen to begin with this work because beyond its beauty, it lends itself well to demonstrating my research process. This manuscript cutting entered the Preservation Society's holding with thousands of other objects at Kingscote when we were gifted the property in 1972. Acquiring that many pieces simultaneously made researching the collection at Kingscote an overwhelming task, with many objects, such as this manuscript, still holding secrets. When the piece entered the collection, it was identified as a medieval illuminated manuscript cutting of the letter O from about the 15th century, made in Italy. It was collected by the father-in-law of Kingscote's owner, a prominent artist named David Maitland Armstrong. The first step in my process to confirm and expand upon this information was to look closer. Upon initial observation, can reveal much about the object and aid us in confirming information in the collection's database. Here, the incredibly detailed and compact painting, likely depicting Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Passover, has details synonymous with the scene, such as the donkey, the grand gate, the palm leaves for Palm Sunday. The scene also appears to be on parchment and contained within a letter. Looking closer, I noticed that this would have been an expensive item from the gilding and fine artistry. I also noticed the linear aspects of the design, such as Jesus' halo and the parallel lines coursing through the gates behind him. After forming my list of observations and confirming the subject, I turned my attention to finding other objects that related to this one in some way. I wondered if there were other similar depictions of Jesus on Palm Sunday. To answer this question, I consulted experts in the field of medieval and Renaissance manuscripts. Comparing our illuminated manuscript cutting with examples of historic engravings, we were able to determine that the subject matter and composition were directly taken from an engraving by celebrated German artist Albrecht Dürer, who lived from 1471 to 1528. Christ's entry into Jerusalem was part of a series titled The Small Passion, which was produced by Dürer around 1508. As you can see here, the artist of our illuminated manuscript cutting was faithful to Dürer's design, which was created with a sharp point rather than a flexible brush. For this reason, engravings are very linear in style. Notice how the spiky light around Christ's head and the lines along the gate in our illumination retain the rigid linearity of the original Dürer engraving that it copied. Based on the known dates of the production of the Small Passion series, we were able to confirm that our manuscript cutting must have been produced after 1500, and we can therefore say it is Renaissance rather than medieval. The next thing I wanted to learn was about the letter surrounding the image. At first, I did not think to question what I was looking at. Take a good look and make your own conclusion about what this letter is. If you have the letter O in mind, then you're thinking what I was thinking back in February. Yet when doing research to locate the source of this particular letter design, I discovered something unexpected. It's the letter D. The collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art includes this comparative example from the Italian Renaissance. It prompted me to try and find other examples of the letter D in Renaissance manuscripts. I looked through hundreds of examples and found many in the collection of the Morgan Library that seemed to confirm the letter in our manuscript was in fact a D rather than an O. The easy-to-miss botanical detail circled here in the top left corner of the work is in fact part of the letter D's composition. Now, turning from the front to the back of the manuscript with help from our conservation team, I was able to examine the cutting out of its frame and found what appeared to be musical notations, suggesting that this work started its life as a choir book. In an effort to identify the musical score on the back of our image, I was fortunate enough to benefit from the paleography skills of our archivist, Jenna Duplessis. And we were able to identify the hymn, God, Do Not Be Far Away, which was traditionally performed during Palm Sunday service and is still sung today. If you look between these images, you can see the hymn in the image on the right and our object's words in context in the red box. The hymn's first word is Domine, meaning Lord, which further confirms our suspicion around the illuminated letter. Sometimes the back of the frame can also provide useful information. An inscription on the back of our frame reads D.M. Armstrong, Rome, 1870, and was most likely written on the frame by Armstrong himself. Armstrong served as consul general in Rome from 1869 to 1871, charged affairs to the Papal States in 1869, and consul general in Rome from 1871 to 1873. It's likely that Armstrong acquired this piece during his time in Rome as a souvenir of his travels. David probably chose this cutting because it was a D, standing for his first name. Armstrong's collecting of the letter was part of a larger practice coined the cult of the alphabet by art historian Roger S. Week. This refers to a Gilded Age craze of collecting and recreating each letter in the alphabet. At the time, there were even books published, like an alphabet of capital letters, that selected and brought together ornamental letters from multiple different manuscripts. With some Gilded Age collectors, such as American Financier J.P. Morgan, this obsession led to collections of hundreds of manuscript pages, books, and cuttings. Many of these collections sought to categorize and redefine art in a way that pertained to their own lives. Context was quite literally cut away in favor of personalization. For David Maitland Armstrong, this particular souvenir appears to be carefully selected for its connection to him and his art. Armstrong pursued art in some capacity for the majority of his life, and when he returned from Italy, this manifested into a stained glass business. Armstrong and his daughter, Helen Maitland Armstrong, worked as business partners to design a litany of windows for private homes and churches. This manuscript cutting displays an early interest in the ecclesiastical themes that Armstrong would come to work with frequently. We can imagine him referring to this piece for personal inspiration and closely looking at each detail with his artist friends. Whether it was Renaissance religious reverence, Gilded Age fascination, or a 21st century fellows lecture, this piece has consistently been valued for the intimate, close-looking experience it provides. Kingscote is full of fascinating small treasures like our manuscript. Another small treasure from the house that's easy to miss is this bronze plaque featuring a portrait of David Maitland Armstrong. This work was completed by his close friend and one of the most important American artists of the 19th century, Augustus St. Gaudens. You probably know St. Gaudens as the famous sculptor behind major public monuments of the Gilded Age, such as the Robert Gould Shaw and Massachusetts 54th Regiment Memorial in Boston and the Standing Lincoln in Chicago. But St. Gaudens also created much more intimate portraits for family and friends, including a series of small bronze portrait plaques. In fact, our portrait of Armstrong is the very first of this series. Before any of his major public commissions, St. Gaudens and his friend, David Maitland Armstrong, were young artists supporting each other through the beginnings of their career. I want to spend a moment looking closely at the portrait. Notice Armstrong's serious expression, tensed brow, and realistic wrinkles. Also notice how the artist's palette, with brushes in the top corner, identify his profession. St. Gaudens emphasizes Armstrong's passion for the arts and also pays close attention to his personality. This is a portrait that communicates a deep familiarity and admiration. Turning to the plaque's caption, however, it seems that St. Gaudens completely lost his attention to detail. Right here, you will see that he not so carefully made out his artwork to his dear friend, D. Maitland Armstrong, skipping a line and creating a strange triangle with the shadow of a misplaced A. Then he signed the work Augustus St. Gaudens. Finally, if we decode the Roman numerals at the bottom, which indicate the date of creation, we can see that St. Gaudens made this in the Gilded Age year of 1977. The inscription is meant to be a joke between friends that juxtaposes the seriousness of Armstrong's portrait. If we look at the plaque that St. Gaudens made for public display at the 1878 Society of American Arts exhibit, we see that the portrait is more or less the same, but the caption is much more cleanly written. With no awkward line breaks, no mistakes, and an accurate date of creation, these differences indicate clearly that St. Gaudens was more careful to maintain a dignified and serious appearance for Armstrong and himself in the plaque he presented for public display. Our plaque shows a different, more humorous and loving spirit. It is an intimate gift meant to be shared between friends. The spirit of jest animates other records we have of Armstrong and St. Gaudens' friendship. Armstrong recalls meeting St. Gaudens on July 3, 1872, at a dinner party in Rome. After getting along well, the two would meet again around 1875 in New York, when St. Gaudens stayed in Armstrong's studio, sleeping on the packing boxes that Armstrong used to ship his furniture from Italy to New York. Our bronze plaque was made during this time as the two artists worked together in the same space. A close and humor-filled friendship formed between them. After St. Gaudens left New York for Paris and Rome, he wrote to Armstrong that he had hanging on his wall a medallion depicting rather a short man, a heavy mustache, an open eye, with his face all tied up in a knot. Notwithstanding that he's a pretty kind of good fellow, the gentleman I mean is not 2 steps from where you now stand. Through moments like these, we get a look into the nature of their friendship. St. Gaudens' humor is a key part of understanding his art and friendship, and is explored by art historian Jennifer Greenhill in her book, Playing It Straight, Art and Humor in the Gilded Age. Greenhill discusses how St. Gaudens injected humor into his work at a time when more serious artwork was trending. In particular, this artist seemed to have found the most enjoyment from humbling humor. Another example of such humor can be seen in this commemorative bronze that he made after a French vacation with 2 prominent American architects, Stanford White and Charles McKim. He caricatured his friends' faces on the metal and carved 3 letters into the middle, KMA, standing for Kiss My. KMA and other variations are seen again and again in correspondence between these 3 men. As Greenhill notes, humor and satire in St. Gaudens's private and public art served as an inside joke between him and his artist friends. This allowed St. Gaudens to express ideas and aspects of his personality that were not welcome in the public arena, especially within the serious grand civic commissions that were coming to define the Gilded Age public sculpture. This gives context to why our plaque's caption is in such a disordered state. By creating a depiction that was both loving and humbling, St. Gaudens simultaneously communicated his admiration for Armstrong and his ability to be himself within the friendship. St. Gaudens developed his humor and lively style in direct contrast to a more classicized, idealized mode of sculpture that had dominated the American art scene in the mid-19th century. The Preservation Society has an example of the earlier classical ideal at the Breakers, where this life-size marble bust of Commodore Vanderbilt by famous American sculptor Hiram Powers is on display in the billiards room. Commodore Vanderbilt, or Cornelius Vanderbilt I, represented the first generation of Vanderbilt wealth. He began the family fortune with a steamship empire, and in a grand display of his success, he built a large private steamship to take him, his wife, and his 12 children on a summer trip around Europe in 1853. While in Rome, he commissioned Powers to make 2 identical portrait busts of him, draped in a Roman toga and gazing into the distance. This depiction was meant to evoke an ancient sense of command, the power of a great leader or emperor. Vanderbilt certainly saw himself as a great leader of American industry and understood how imposing portraits, like this one, could embody and help consolidate his power. The portrait really wasn't meant to accurately reveal the personality of the man. It was meant to project an image of greatness, exactly how Vanderbilt wanted his generation to see him. So sometimes, when the object refuses to tell you much about the person behind their public mask, the correspondence left around it tells you more. In the Smithsonian Archive of American Art, there's a series of letters between Hiram Powers, a middleman, and Commodore Vanderbilt. As I began to transcribe this difficult handwriting, I realized that Powers was upset at Vanderbilt over a refusal to pay for something. I realized that the issue was so serious that Powers threatened to put Vanderbilt's bust on a shelf labeled, "For debt." This was a time when his studio was a public place frequented by important people. Powers was threatening to damage the Commodore's reputation. So what was the issue? Vanderbilt, a shipping magnate, would not pay for the shipping costs. In another letter, Powers says, "I do not like at all Mr. Vanderbilt's hesitation to pay, and if he has not done so by the time this reaches you, make him pay. Between ourselves and from what I have heard, there may be another Barnum affair with him." Moving past my curiosity of what an underlined "make him pay" implies, I wanted to understand what Powers meant by Barnum affair. To do this, I looked in period newspapers from the same months, April and May of 1856, and found that the famous showman and businessman P.T. Barnum was going through a very public bankruptcy case. So in referencing Barnum, Powers is wondering if the Commodore is actually bankrupt and thus cannot afford the shipping. Vanderbilt was eventually persuaded to pay the shipping costs, allowing him to receive his bust and safeguard his reputation. Although there are no known photographs of the bust in the Commodore's home in New York, the New York Times reported that the bust was on display prominently in his reception room. In this most public of rooms in the house, it was meant to send a message of power to anyone entering his home. This purpose persisted as the bust passed down to his son, William Henry Vanderbilt, and then to his son, Cornelius Vanderbilt II. These photographs show the bust and its copy on display prominently in Cornelius Vanderbilt II's New York townhouse. And so now for our final object, I thought it would be appropriate, since we are in Rosecliff tonight, to revisit costumes from the Great Gatsby films, which was partially shot in this room just 51 years ago. After filming The Great Gatsby at Rosecliff, Breakers, and Marble House, Paramount Pictures gifted the Preservation Society 2 of the iconic costumes worn in the film. One was worn by Daisy, played by Mia Farrow, and the other by Gatsby himself, played by Robert Redford. We didn't have a lot of information on how the costumes were designed and made, but we knew Ralph Lauren had a hand in the suit's creation. As I dug deeper into period sources like newspaper interviews and spoke with individuals involved in the making of the film, I learned about the extraordinary talents of the film's maker, costume designer, a woman named Theone Aldrich. Aldrich immigrated from Greece to the US in the 1950s and began her costume designing career working on stage costumes for the Goodman Theater in New York City. She would go on to design for a variety of Broadway and film projects. When she took on the Great Gatsby costume assignment, the project was already on a quick deadline. With 3 weeks to come up with the designs for the main characters and a plan for the extras' costumes, Aldrich began studying and talking with the actors about what they wanted to wear. Aldrich closely studied F. Scott Fitzgerald's original story, and some of her choices rhyme with the text. One glaring difference, though, is the color of Gatsby's suit. In the film, the suit is a light shade of pink. In the book, the suit is described as a gorgeous pink rag of a suit that made a bright spot of color against the white steps. It's understood to be a deeper and bolder hue. The suit's color separates Gatsby from the quiet luxury appeal of the old money characters like Tom and feeds Tom's suspicion of Gatsby. So what happened? Why was the suit's color toned down for the film? After reading interviews with Aldrich, I found that Robert Redford himself selected the lightest shade from a selection of 25 different pink color swatches that Aldrich gave him to choose from. In an interview with the Boston Globe, Aldrich said that Redford feared that wearing a deeper shade of pink would label him as gay. This concern is a testament to the time's rampant homophobia at a time when there was deep systematic discrimination against LGBTQ people in Hollywood and when the fight for LGBTQ plus rights was just beginning to take off after the Stonewall Uprising. With this context, the suit takes on a meaning beyond the film alone and becomes a study in the wide-ranging effects of discrimination. But moving back to the movie's tight deadline, Aldrich brought in designer Ralph Lauren and costume maker Barbara Matera to help with the costumes. At this time, fashion designer Jeffrey Banks was Ralph Lauren's design assistant, and he kindly spoke to me about the project and recalled working on Gatsby. In fact, he remembered that he was the one to take Redford's measurements for the suit. Our conversation gave me a better appreciation for the diverse individuals at work in the various dimensions of creating these costumes. And before we move on to the dress, I wanted to share a little secret with you. While handling the suit, I was intrigued by the breast pocket handkerchief, and when I peeled back the fold, I was greeted by the surprise of a little white flower tucked inside. It's not a daisy, but it's reminiscent of her name, and it is never actually shown in the film. The flower is held physically close to Gatsby's heart, strongly suggesting the hidden love between him and Daisy. For Daisy's costumes, Aldrich had a similar design ethos. She wanted to involve the actors in the design process while also enhancing the film's themes. She asked Mia Farrow what her favorite color was, to which she responded, the rainbow. Aldrich incorporated the idea of a rainbow into her wardrobe by designing various pastel dresses. Continuing to run up against the issue of deadlines, Aldrich hired Barbara Matera to execute the various designs. The dress that the Preservation Society has is worn when Daisy explains to Gatsby that she could not wait for him and had no choice but to marry Tom, a dilemma that Gatsby does not understand. In talking about her forced marriage, she's wearing a white satin silk slip and silk chiffon overdress covered in lace flowers, mirroring a wedding gown. In this scene, Aldrich's design portrays her as a frozen bride, reliving the moment that she was powerless to change due to the expectations placed upon her. Also, pay close attention to the flowy, cloud-like chiffon fabric that is a common theme in almost every one of Daisy's costumes. This design choice may have been intended as a visual metaphor for the hazy, confused mentality that Daisy is in as she tries to change the past with Gatsby and maintain her relationship with Tom. Throughout the movie, Aldrich's designs communicate what dialogue cannot, making her work crucial to the success of the film and the 1920s-inspired fashion trend that came after it. That brings me to the end of our object deep dives, and while I would love to keep talking to you all, it would take a whole book to explain everything we are researching, and that's why we're making one. Stay tuned for the contents of this wonderful publication. We can't wait to share it with you all. I would now like to thank those who are crucial to this program, including our CEO, Trudy Cox, Chairman Peter Harris, Eaddo and Peter Kiernan, supporters of the Residential Fellows Program, and everyone in the Museum Affairs Department who was there for me every step of the way. Now, if you cannot wait for the catalog and need more object deep dives right now, then you will love my next speaker's presentation, my colleague and friend, Isabella Hogan.
Thank you very much, Priscilla, for that wonderful presentation and introduction. Hello, everybody. My name is Isabella Hogan, and I am a Conservation Research Fellow here at the Preservation Society. And I would like to begin my talk tonight by transporting you out of Rosecliff, over to an Italian Renaissance-inspired mansion, which was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, constructed between 1893 and 1895, and which served as the summer residence of Cornelius Vanderbilt II and his family. And if you haven't already guessed, I'm talking about the Breakers. Specifically, I want to take you up to the 3rd floor, where 3 of the Vanderbilt sons, Cornelius Vanderbilt III, Alfred Vanderbilt, and Reginald Vanderbilt, would have lived. And to help you envision what this 3rd floor would have looked like in the 1890s, I'm showing you this watercolor of the bedroom of Cornelius Vanderbilt III. This watercolor was created by the offices of Ogden Codman Jr., the interior decorator for the 2nd and 3rd floor of the Breakers. And it's part of a series of watercolors that Codman produced for the Breakers, which are currently held by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Codman's watercolors are not exact representations of the realized design, but they do reveal his creative intentions for the family spaces of the Breakers. They convey a level of charm and elegance that is slightly more subtle and muted compared to the grandiose appearance of the public spaces on the 1st floor of the Breakers. And keeping this image in mind, I'm moving us forward to the present day. 130 years after the Breakers was finished, this is what the same space looks like. And I think you'll agree that it's quite a difference. Perhaps the main change that draws the eye is the coloring of the cotton wall fabrics, where the original blue dyes have faded due to natural sunlight exposure, except for a square over on the right-hand side of the screen, where a framed picture, once hung, preventing this area from fading to the same extent. And as a small aside, the coloring of this protected square tells us that the original wall fabrics would have been more of an indigo blue than the light blue shown in Codman's watercolors. Regardless, the main reason I want you to have these 2 impressions of the 3rd floor in mind is to showcase the importance of our conservation work at the Breakers and to highlight how my fellowship work fits into our wider preservation project that we're undertaking on the 3rd floor. And with that, over the past year, my own fellowship research has focused on the furniture on the 3rd floor, which was ordered by Ogden Codman Jr., shown on the left, and created by a Boston-based furniture manufacturer, Davenport and Company, the owner of which, Albert Henry Davenport, is shown on the right. The name Davenport may ring familiar to some of you, for the company lends its name to a particular style of sofa that you see on screen. And this photograph comes from the Davenport Memorial Home, which was Davenport's family home, which was constructed in Malden, in Massachusetts, in 1892. Now, the name Davenport would have likely also been familiar amongst Gilded Age high society, for between 1880 and 1914, Davenport and Company became one of the most important manufacturers of luxury furniture, responsible for at least part of the commissions at Hyde Park in New York, Glessner House in Illinois, the Iolani Palace in Hawaii, and perhaps their most famous contract, several rooms in the White House under the Theodore Roosevelt administration in 1902. Over at the Breakers, A.H. Davenport and Company produced furniture for the second and third floor. And on screen now are some of the examples of the different furniture types that we find on the third floor. One of the remarkable aspects of this collection is that it is preserved in situ, in the original location as intended by Ogden Codman Jr. and the Vanderbilts. And it's thanks to the careful stewardship of the Vanderbilts and their descendants, the Sechanis and the Saparis, that we have access to this fantastic collection and that we can use it to learn more about A.H. Davenport and Company. I also want you to be aware that my research here very much builds upon the contribution and work of several other researchers, including Pauline Metcalf, Anne Farnham, Nancy Carlisle, Melissa Nowlin, and Lauren McGuinn, as well as members of our own curatorial and conservation team. And I would very much encourage you to go find their work and publications if you want to learn more about Ogden Codman Jr. and A.H. Davenport. For my own research, what I've been trying to do with this collection is understand the material composition, the design, the construction, and the condition of each piece of furniture. And there are 66 pieces that I've looked at in detail. But rather than talking about all 66 tonight, for we'd be here all evening, I'm going to focus on two particular examples, these two bureaus, one in the Louis XVI style, shown on the left, and one in the Louis XV style, shown on the right. And the very first thing, there we go. The very first thing I want to show you about these bureaus is their material breakdown, what each piece is comprised of. And there are really two key pieces of information that you need to retain from this slide. Firstly, that the wood used on the exterior is a walnut wood. And secondly, that the wood used for the interior of the drawers is a mahogany. And we will return to these two woods and their different treatment a little bit later on. For now, let's take a closer look at the design process of this Louis XVI style bureau. For during the course of my research, I was able to find and study the original design drawings for our furniture. And these drawings are held in the Ogden Codman Jr. archives at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the A.H. Davenport and Company archives at Historic New England. And what I would like you to do while I'm speaking is compare the sketch to the photograph of the bureau so that you can track for yourself the change in design over time, from the early concept to the final piece realized by Davenport. The sketch that we're looking at right now comes from the Ogden Codman Jr. archives at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and this is the earliest sketch that we know of for our bureau. And there are two particular details that I want to draw your attention to. Firstly, in the corners of the sketch, the number 10 has been recorded. And this is significant because it matches the room number that our bureau is located in. So for reference, this is a floor plan of the third floor of the Breakers, which was created by the architect Richard Morris Hunt. And if we zoom in to the bedroom where our bureau is located, we can see that it's labeled number 10. So we know that this is a sketch of our bureau. The second detail I want to draw your attention to is this annotation in the lower right-hand corner, which reads, "Bureau, marble top, handles everywhere." And indeed, when you compare the sketch to the final piece, we can see that they did in fact put handles everywhere. The second sketch that I would like you to compare to the final photograph comes from the A.H. Davenport archives at Historic New England. And based on the changes in design and the accuracy of the height measurement along the side, this appears to be a later drawing than the one we just looked at. Once again, the annotations aid our interpretation. Specifically, the words along the very bottom, which read, "Made for C. Vanderbilt, Order 27951, are significant. Why? Well, we currently do not have any correspondence between A.H. Davenport and Company and Ogden Codman Jr., or between A.H. Davenport and the Vanderbilts discussing the Breakers contract, nor do we have any stamps or branding or nameplates on our furniture which prove that it is an A.H. Davenport creation. However, the order numbers that we see in these sketches are written on the furniture itself. So in this particular example, the number 27951 appears on the underside of the marble top and on the wooden top of our bureau, confirming that these are in fact A.H. Davenport creations. Thank goodness. There are a range of other markings on the Davenport furniture which give us clues about Davenport's production practices and the operation of his factory. So if we turn now to our second bureau and take a look at the hidden internal components, namely the drawer cavity and the dustboard, what we find is that there are two distinctive tool marks that we can match up to particular machinery used during the late 19th century. So on the left, we have these curved, arch-like kerf marks, these saw marks, which are left behind by a circular saw, likely a bench-sized one, as shown in the image on the right. The second type of tool mark, there we go, are these shadowy parallel lines, these striations, which are left behind by the rotating blade head of a machine planer, which is shown on the left, and this is used to smooth and level the surface of boards. So with these two tool marks, we have clear evidence that Davenport relied upon machinery in order to produce their furniture. In contrast, there are other production marks on the Davenport furniture which show that the more intricate and detailed processes were done by hand rather than by machine. And the construction of the mahogany drawers is an excellent example of this. So the drawers are held together by dovetail joints, which are made up of wooden pins and tails. And occasionally, we see the saw marks left behind by a handsaw, which has overshot its mark. It's cut past the scribing line, which marks out the position of the dovetails. Interestingly enough, the machinery to produce dovetails did exist during the late 19th century, but it was sometimes critiqued in the contemporary literature as being inefficient compared to the trained laborer. And even today, dovetails are commonly produced by hand. In a similar way, the decorative detailing on the Davenport furniture shows signs of being hand-carved rather than machine-carved. So if we go back to our first bureau and take a look at the rosettes that decorate the legs, what we find is that there is a slightly uneven and undulating surface around the rosette, which points to the use of carving knives and gouges. As an additional detail, the rest of the furniture which accompanies this bureau in bedroom number 10 also has rosettes carved into its legs. And when we compare these rosettes, what we see is that there are differences. Some have more petals than others, and some are carved more in relief. And these differences are further evidence of the variation introduced by hand carving. And I think that in this case we can go further and say that we're actually seeing the result of different hands, different people, responsible for the same design. To solidify our understanding of Davenport's production, I was able to locate a map of his 4-story furniture factory, which was located on 108 Cambridge Street in East Cambridge. And one of the interesting details in this map is that it shows us exactly what was happening in each building on each floor of the factory, which means that we can track exactly where our bureaus were during different stages of production. So if we zoom in on one building in particular, we can see that the sawing and planing took place on the first floor. The benchwork and the cutting of those dovetails would have taken place on the second and third floor, whilst the hand carving of those rosettes took place on the 4th floor. So this helps us build a rather comprehensive understanding of the structure and operation of a late 19th century furniture factory. And altogether, what this combination of hand and machine tool marks show is that during the late 19th century, which was a time of increased mechanization of production, A.H. Davenport were following a wider trend in high-end furniture making, whereby machinery was used to render construction more efficient, but not to replace the work of skilled laborers. The final aspect of my research was to study and understand the condition of the furniture so that we can restore and preserve it moving forwards. And what I found is that structurally, our pieces are in excellent condition, which is testament to the skill of Davenport's workforce. However, the furniture finishes require a bit more attention. So if you remember back to the beginning of my talk, we saw the effects of natural sunlight exposure on the wall fabrics. Well, sunlight has also affected our furniture. And what these images show are the areas in which sunlight has broken down the varnish and bleached the exposed wooden surfaces. And in order to respond to this effect, we first need to understand what kind of furniture finish we're dealing with, so we need to identify the finish. And the first step to identification involves microscopic examination, removing a small sample of the wood and the varnish, embedding it in a clear resin, and examining this under the microscope. And what we end up with is a cross-section of a sample, which shows the different layers of wood and furniture finish. The earliest layers are located at the bottom, and in this case, that's layer 0, the wood, and any successive layers are found on top. We can look at these samples under normal visible light and under ultraviolet light. So on screen at the moment, there are 2 photographs showing the same sample. The image on the left is the visible light image, and the image on the right is the ultraviolet light image. And it's often the ultraviolet light images that are more useful to our interpretation, because different materials can be distinguished by their different colors, their different fluorescences. And as a small disclaimer, sometimes the colors that we see under the microscope are not quite captured accurately by our cameras. So if there are any small discrepancies between my words and my images, I would ask that you please believe me. So what does this microscopy actually tell us? Well, we're looking at a sample from the exterior walnut wood. And what we can see is that there is one consistent layer of varnish, which suggests that we're dealing with the original finish applied by the workers at Davenport and Company, his factory. There's no evidence of any varnish below or on top. Secondly, we can tell that we're dealing with a varnish as opposed to a dye or a stain, because dyes and stains would penetrate down into the wood layer, whereas ours sits neatly on top. We can also tell that we're dealing with a natural resin in this varnish because of the orange fluorescence, and that's as opposed to a synthetic one. And finally, we can tell that the varnish has been deliberately modified by the addition of pigments, in this case a mixture of black, brown, and occasionally red pigments, which are the spots that you can see within the varnish layer 1. So this information is a great starting point for understanding our varnish, but it doesn't quite lead us to that identification. So for identification, we reached out to the University of Rhode Island to conduct an analytical technique known as Fourier Transform Infrared Spectroscopy, FTIR. And very simply, FTIR allows us to identify different materials based on their interactions with infrared radiation. So different materials absorb or transmit this radiation differently, and we can visualize this data almost like a fingerprint in the form of a graph or a spectrum. And when I compare my spectrum to a database of reference samples, I found a match with shellac. So my sample is the orange line, and the shellac reference sample is the purple line. And we're really interested in this case in the position of the peaks as opposed to their intensities. And there are slight differences between these 2 lines that you will notice, but I'll address that in a little bit. Shellac is a resin secreted by the female lac insect, which is primarily found in India and Thailand. And by the late 19th century, shellac was a very common furniture varnish. Part of the reason behind its popularity is that it was a spirit varnish, which means it's dissolved in alcohol. And as a spirit varnish, shellac is very easy to apply and later on reapply. It also is high gloss, and it dries very quickly, particularly compared to an oil resin varnish. And so our identification of the varnish used on the walnut wood as shellac is not surprising given the historical context. And now that we have this information, we can begin to plan out our treatments. We can select materials that would be compatible with an aged shellac varnish. Now, having obtained this identification, for comparison, I wanted to understand whether Davenport used the same varnish on the mahogany wood on the interior of the drawers, where the varnish is better preserved. So I repeated the same microscopy and FTIR processes on samples from the interior. And if we start with the microscopy images, we can see what we have is the walnut wood sample that we just talked about on the left, and then our mahogany sample is on the right. And if we look at the mahogany sample, we can see that there are 2 layers of varnish that have been added, though tonight I'm mainly going to concentrate on that primary layer, layer 1, as it's more consistent across my samples. And the main observation in the mahogany sample is that the varnish fluoresces differently to the shellac on the left. It fluoresces more of a white-blue than the orange of the shellac. So this suggests that we're dealing with 2 different varnishes. However, when we turn to the FTIR data, what we see is that the exterior and the interior samples line up very neatly, and both of those spectra match up nicely with our shellac reference sample. So this tells us that we actually have shellac being used on the exterior walnut wood and shellac being used on the interior mahogany. So why do they look different under ultraviolet light? Well, my current theory is that the shellac used on the interior was deliberately chemically bleached before it was applied to the mahogany in order to remove the coloring compounds that give shellac this distinctive orange fluorescence. And this was done in order to create a white lac, which is a more transparent furniture finish that would allow the natural coloring of the mahogany wood, the more expensive wood, to show through, although walnut is also an expensive wood for this period. More generally, what this data shows is that A.H. Davenport and Company are deliberately processing and making up their varnishes differently. They have different recipes that they adapt to different woods. And that might sound like a rather simple conclusion, but it is an important one, considering we don't have any documentary evidence for Davenport's varnish recipes. The other important detail that we can obtain from this FTIR data relates to the stability of the varnish. So if we focus in on the regions of slight difference between the interior and the exterior spectra, what we find is that there is a peak shift, or there's a peak missing, if you will, in the orange line. And I believe this reflects the aging of the varnish, whereby the shellac on the exterior, on the walnut wood, is undergoing a sunlight-induced chemical change and degradation that we don't see on the varnish on the interior, since the drawers are shielded from sunlight. So this provides the concrete evidence that we have to deal with sunlight exposure on the 3rd floor, as it is chemically affecting our furniture. And we have already taken steps to try and limit light exposure on the 3rd floor, for example by installing ultraviolet light filters on our windows. Moving forwards, we need to try and stabilize the existing shellac that is on the furniture, but also think about restoring and revarnishing some of the exposed areas. And carrying out some of this treatment work will be part of my role next year, as my fellowship here at the Preservation Society has been very generously extended for another year. And so, I would ask all of you, if you've enjoyed hearing me talk tonight, that is, to return in a year's time to see what else we have been able to uncover about A.H. Davenport and their work at the Breakers. To satisfy you in the meantime, we also offer a Preservation in Progress tour on the 3rd floor, which is periodically updated with our findings as we continue to research and protect this space. And that leads me to my final thank you to all of you for listening to us tonight. Thank you to Trudy Cox, to Peter Harris, to Eaddo and Peter Kiernan, the conservation team, and everyone else who has assisted me with this research. Thank you very much for listening.
Priscilla, you want to come back up? Okay, so a year from now, FTIR. You'll all have to remember what that is because there will be a quiz. We will now take questions from the audience.
Thank you both. That was very enjoyable. Priscilla, I'd imagine that with so much research to look into, was there anything that was surprising or interesting that you discovered or found during your journey?
Yes, I think you unlocked the bonus slides. So surprising is a good word for it. I was actually working on a desk that is in Chateau-sur-Mer, that is made by Kimball and Cavus, a New York furniture firm started by a German and French immigrant to the US. And while I was studying them, I went to Kingscote with one of our wonderful conservation members, Carola, and we were poking around Kingscote at another desk that we have there by Kimball and Cavus, and I happened to walk into a room and see this standing shelf. And from poring over the Brooklyn Museum's publication on Kimball and Cavus, I recognized these little mice on the side of it, which actually is a Christopher Dresser symbol that he has in one of his books, and was used by Kimball and Cavus on a lot of their furniture. And so you can actually see it here in Kimball and Cavus's collection catalog, that the standing shelves are identical to the ones we have. I've been unable to find other examples in existence currently. And it was also $28, which is a lot more today, inflation. But yeah, that was the most surprising, I would say.
Thank you very much, both. Am I too close to this? Is this okay? All right. So thank you very much, both. Many of us in this room have enjoyed your presentations and your lectures going through the spaces. And we're going to miss you, Priscilla, and we're so happy, Isabella, that we're going to continue seeing you. And I have a question for Isabella. Could you tell us a bit more about Ogden Codman, what interests you about Ogden Codman, which you'd like to talk about in general, but also in particular with his work at the Breakers, other than what you have addressed here. Thank you. I have one more question. If there was anything you could ask the Met to donate to the Preservation Society, if you would.
Okay, I don't know if I can answer that second question, but Ogden Codman is quite a character, and I think what I've enjoyed throughout this fellowship is learning about his personality. So Ogden Codman Jr. is an American-born architect and interior decorator, and he was born in Boston in 1863, I believe, and he spent his early life between America and France, and these experience and exposure to these two cultures very much shaped him as an interior decorator. In 1891, he sets up his own architectural firm here in America, and he gets a lot of clients in Boston, in Newport, and in New York, and a lot of his clients initially are his friends, so he mixes his personal and professional life very intimately. And I think that's an interesting thing to bear in mind about Codman's work at the Breakers, is that it's quite early on in his career. The Breakers commission, he obtains this commission late in 1893, so very early on. And Historic New England has an excellent archival record about Ogden Codman Jr. and the family more generally. And I was fortunate enough to look through some of this archive and read through some of the correspondence, both between Richard Morris Hunt, the architect of the Breakers, and Ogden Codman Jr., and between Ogden Codman Jr. and his mother, Sarah Bradley Codman, who he wrote to very often, which is very nice to know. And in the correspondence from Richard Morris Hunt, we really get the impression that, let's say, Codman is not necessarily giving Hunt all the information that Hunt needs for this Breakers project. So Hunt chases him up for design drawings, for measurements, for information about the particular type of marble that he wants. So I think the Breakers for Codman is almost a learning process in establishing himself early on in his career. And this is a nice contrast to the Codman personality that we see coming through in his personal letters when he writes to his mum, where he writes, and I'm paraphrasing, how enthusiastic he is to be working with the Vanderbilts, how lovely the Vanderbilts are. They invite him round for dinner. He goes crabbing with the Vanderbilt daughters. So he really has this seemingly close connection with them, which I think maybe gives him a little bit of leeway, perhaps, in the breaker's contract. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Got one back here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Sylvie Bello. I'm with the Cameroon American Council, and this has been a wonderful presentation. And I was just wondering, for the book that's coming out, do you know if any of the pieces will have any African American? I'm from the Baltimore, D.C. area, where we have a strong Black artist community, one of which I'm thinking of is Joshua Johnson. So in your research for the book, do you know if any of the pieces would have any connections? That's the first question. The second question is, on the second presentation, do you know if any of the furniture, since you broke down the furniture, either this presentation or your other research, is there anything that would provenance from like North Carolina? Again, any African American aspects or, thank you.
Hi, yes, wonderful question. We actually, part of the reason I was so excited to come to this project was because of the diversity that the objects were chosen with, not just in material, but also in story. And so one of the objects that is actually on the list, sneak peek, is a medallion that came from, I believe, the English abolition movement. The exact description I'm not sure because it wasn't one of the ones that I particularly studied, but it is questioning if the person on the medallion is lesser than the person who's viewing the medallion just because they are enslaved, just because they're African American. So that's one of the objects you can look forward to. And then I'll let Isabella.
Unfortunately, I don't really know about any connection in terms of the furniture. I'm still trying to do research into understanding the composition of Davenport's workforce, so something might come out in the next year. I know Davenport employed, at least in 1890, I have the figures that he employed around 300 people, but I don't know very much about their identities or the exact breakdown, but maybe in the future, hopefully, we will find something. Thank you.
Priscilla, I'm just wondering if you could give us a sense of how much time it typically takes to research an object. It seems like you put a lot into it, but curious how long on average it might take.
Endless. It depends on the object. Some of them were quick work, but probably still have a lot of things that I've missed that other eyes will be able to see. But I mean, one of the objects, a painting that I worked on that's in Breakers, and a painting that I worked on in Elms, I started at the beginning of this fellowship, and I went to the MFA 2 weeks ago to find the final nail in the coffin for where it came from originally. So the real answer is 2 weeks for depending on what I'm looking for, or months and months of trying to find what I'm looking for. And I'm sure I will continue to think about a lot of these objects, wake up in the middle of the night, wondering that last detail about the Fontabazo. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question for Isabella. You talked a little bit about planning the treatments for some of the furniture. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that might look like.
Yes, absolutely. So with our varnished furniture, as I highlighted in my presentation, the main issue are the areas where the shellac has been broken down and where the wood has been bleached. So our treatment will focus on tackling those areas. And to that end, there are really two main approaches that we can take or we can consider. And the first is a more traditional approach, which involves using our own mix of shellac We can try and match the pigments that Davenport used, so we can try and find a combination of red, brown, and black that will produce a nice finish and a nice surface so that the pieces look aesthetically whole once we finish treating them. And shellac takes very nicely to shellac. Aged shellac takes new shellac very well, so that is helpful to that end. And then the second option is using more modern materials, so finding a synthetic varnish, which we can try and match, tinting the wood surface to deal with the areas that have been bleached. But before we decide which path we go down, we have to do a lot of testing. So we'll find walnut samples and test our shellac varnish with our synthetic varnish and see which provides the most protection and the most aesthetically integrated restoration. Yeah.
Well, last question up here.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Pike, and I've been through Marble House dozens of times, but I got two specific questions. There's the sculpture of one of the many racehorses, one of them Mantillon in Marble House, and then in one of the small rooms up on the mezzanine that were places where the men would greet each other, and the other side on Marble House, the other room where the women would meet. Do you have any, it's kind of a two-part question here, but do you have any idea about the type of paint that was used to do the paintings in those two, in that room where the men would meet? And also, do you have any insight into the material or sculpting of the horse Mantillon that's on display in Marble House, right in that mezzanine area? I was curious, is it wood or what? Could you expand on that a little bit? I looked at it and great time for me to ask.
Yeah, good question, because I worked on the Hasseltine sculpture that you're talking about. It was an American artist in France, Herbert Hasseltine, who made the bronze portrait of Maintenant, which was Willie K. Vanderbilt's racehorse. And right next to it, we have a plaque of all of the races he won at the age of 3. I was actually able to find the bronze foundry that made that specific sculpture in Paris, close to where that horse would have done most of its races. One interesting aspect of that I went for was the horse's expression, its body language, which Herbert Hasseltine would have sculpted from life, and the horse's emotions from its ears, its eyes, its stomach showed that it was interested but a little nervous. So that was fun. And then for your second question, the paintings are of other racehorses of Willie K's, and those would be either most likely oil on canvas, if not oil on panel. Yes, thank you for your question.
Well, let's give another round of applause for our fellows. I just want to again thank Isabella, Priscilla, Teo, who has, over there, he's hiding in the back, Teo, who are here tonight, and Laura, who's already off on her PhD quest down at Vanderbilt University. But what an incredible group of young, talented scholars. We so look forward to seeing what the future holds for you. Thank you for all of your contributions to us. And thank all of you for being members and joining us this evening. This is a great group. Our fellows lecturers are growing in attendance, so thank you for your support of the Preservation Society, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.